Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. We've been diving through the book, The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis. This has been already a very challenging read, and we've only just hit chapter 2. I feel like that we have to attach an extra brain cell or reactivate an extra brain cell that we lost along the way. I was just sharing with John briefly. C.S. Lewis reminds me of one of my teachers at school, at university, who assumes that the whole class knows exactly what she is talking about and just carries on going a million miles an hour. But nonetheless, we are courageously trying to work through C.S. Lewis. He has some pretty deep concepts, and myself, John, and Dee are going to do our best to offer some commentary to that and try and dive in. Let's start with a few things. Let's talk about the nature of freedom of choice or free will. Let's maybe start there, because it seems to me that a lot of what C.S. Lewis is implying is that once there is free will, once there is free choice, then you simply cannot take out suffering as a result of that. That's my take in just a few words. Is that your take? Do you resonate with what I just said? Is that what you understood from the reading? So
yeah,
maybe you can start.
Definitely. I mean, to some degree, it's almost like it comes as a package. There's both sides to this coin, so to speak, and you can't have one without the other to some degree. I mean, that was kind of my take on it.
Was that you too, Dee?
Yes, I mean, God gave you that freedom of choice, and if He is to basically that whatever happens to us, it's really a consequence of the choices that we make. Mm-hmm. And if God is to, after giving us that freedom of choice, and intervene in a way, I guess what he would call a miracle, right? Mm-hmm. And if He did that every single time, so that we don't end up in a problem with sin, or we don't end up suffering or whatever, then essentially He has taken away our freedom of choice. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Sure. There wasn't sorry, go on, John.
I was going to say, it's an interesting dichotomy. I mean, people, they'll say, and I think C.S. Lewis started this chapter by basically saying, God is good and He wants the best for His creation. And, if He can do everything because He's God, then why does He let people suffer? And it's exactly like Dee was saying, He knows what's best for you, and He can do what's best for you. But at some point, that takes away your freedom to choose for yourself. And unfortunately, choosing for yourself, the other side of that coin is the consequences that come with that choice. And it's interesting. God does what a lot of parents can't do. He's all loving, but He also gives you, complete freedom. And so He'll step back and let you make the choices you want. But at the same time, you're going to suffer the consequences.
I do think that C.S. Lewis caused us to stand back from life on a molecular level in this chapter, and try to stretch our minds to the concept of not just the dimensions of what we usually talk about in terms of free will, which is my choices, your choices, things that affect each other. He asked us to step back on the basis of matter in and of itself affects other matter, just by virtue of the fact that it's in the same environment. And by changing one domino of one choice that I make over something, and he gave the example, for instance, of a wooden block that might be used to hit someone over the head, which I thought was a decent analogy. And he posed a question to retort that. what would happen is if the wood changed or turned soft, if it was going to be used under an evil pretense, because everything affects everything, and I think what he was trying to build was this perspective that your singular choice fits into a domino of so many things which are much larger than you can even imagine, and God's omnipotence keeps all of that together. That's my take on it. I don't know if that's how you saw it as well.
I mean, it reminds me of, in a lot of ways, creation, where God takes everything that the world was made up of, but basically in no order at all. So I'm in complete chaos, and he uses that to create order with what we have. I mean, that's the whole worldview. But I think in everyone's life, there's a certain amount of chaos, and I think there's a certain amount of order God can provide for that. But I mean, there's the individual, there's the family, there's the community, and choices made on all those levels affect everything around you. I mean, an individual in a family can't make a choice without affecting the rest of the family, and same with the family and the communities.
Definitely.
I mean, the first part of the chapter, he talked about how, God cannot contradict himself, So, for example, like when I read it, I was thinking, yeah, I mean, I suppose he could, but I don't know if he doesn't. I mean, yeah, because the first thing that came to my mind was that, when he said that the outcome of sin is death, right? Mm-hmm. And so when Adam and Eve sinned, yeah, I suppose he could have changed that, and there could have been no death. There could have not been any separation. But if he had done that, like, he would be contradicting what he had said. And I think that when you, especially like a God who's that all-powerful, mighty God, right, is constantly changing his mind about certain things that he has said, and intervenes or created and intervenes, then that means it's like, well, can you really trust this God? I mean, and then the whole, in my mind, this idea of this fairness comes into play then. So then, like, why do you intervene in this situation and then maybe not in that certain situation? And so the whole idea that God, I'm not sure if he probably could, but he doesn't go back on his words once he has said something, that it will be done in a certain way. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if I'm understanding that.
It's interesting you use the word fairness, because while you were talking, my thought was, how does grace fit into what God does? Because, sin in a lot of ways is very black and white. And you have God in the Old Testament where things seem to be a lot more black and white, but then you have Jesus coming into the New Testament as this God of love with, grace that allows there to be kind of shades of gray all of a sudden. And so, you were using the word fairness, but I think I was thinking the word grace at the same time. And I don't know, maybe C.S. Lewis gets into that a little bit later, but
that's a really interesting concept, because if you think about the idea of a God who doesn't necessarily change everything down to its last detail, because he wants to be because he wants to be a fair God, you could argue that grace is an interruption to all that is fair to humanity, so to speak. Let me ask this question, because this really popped up in my mind. I don't know if it came up in your mind, kind of linked. So it's clear that we live in a world at the moment where it's possible to have wrong actions.
Mm-hmm.
My question, and I don't think C.S. Lewis necessarily covered it, but maybe hinted at it. My question is God aiming for a world where it is impossible for there to be wrong actions? Do you guys understand my question?
I think so. I think I understand the question.
So,
I guess the only objection I have for that is it makes it sound like God is intentionally aiming for that type of a world, where I would say,
aiming for a world where it's impossible to make wrong choices.
Yeah,
No.
and I would.
No.
Yeah, I would disagree with that, because I would say that, I mean, the Garden of Eden is a good example. It was a perfect world with a perfect creation and a perfect man and woman that made a wrong choice.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think right there, that kind of contradicts what you're saying. And I think the new earth will be similar.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there won't be sin, but it's not because it's impossible to sin. It's because we've experienced the sin and everything that's bad about it.
Mm-hmm.
And we love God, and well, not hopefully, very likely in a much higher level now, that we'd never want to go back, and we'd never want to enter that world of sin that we've already experienced again.
Yeah, I mean, I agree exactly with what John said. I mean, yeah, he absolutely wants a world where there is no sin, there's no pain and suffering, but there's no way he's going to force that on us. But definitely, he wants a world, a relationship where we continuously choose him over anything else.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what it is.
And that's why I asked the question, because I
Mm-hmm.
think C.S. Lewis was subtly hinting at the reality of a God who allows autonomy for humanity to exist in their free will and choices, in the hope that one day, I mean, C.S. Lewis doesn't talk about this, but if we bring our Adventist theological picture into the perspective now, we know that one day God is going to recreate this earth brand new. And by brand new, I'm hinting back to the Edenic vision, back to how it was initially. I say this quite often because he never made a mistake in the first place. And humanity won't be robbed from that autonomy that it was first given. In fact, humanity will be given back more autonomy, given the history of what humanity has to go through. And this actually supports the notion of God's even more great divine omnipotence, because he hands that over to humanity. And it's conventional to suggest a powerful God would do everything.
Right.
But this God that we serve is a God that says, no, you do it. Because I've created you to do it. I've created you to make the best choices. I've created you to do all these wonderful things. And so, yeah, that's why I asked the question, because it supports the notion of a God who is divinely omnipotent in that perspective.
I think a big part of our problem, and it comes up with this word omnipotence, power to do all, or the power to do everything. And that's kind of a dream we have as humanity. I mean, that's where you get the Marvel comics, and it'd be cool to be able to have this or to be able to do this. And as a sinful human being, sometimes our best concept of God is an enhanced version of ourself.
100%.
And that's a mistake, because I think the Old Testament God and the New Testament God are the same God. I think you had a view of the Old Testament God that's a little bit more limited, because humanity at the time wasn't prepared for what we see in Jesus in the New Testament.
Right.
And so God has always been fair, to use Dee's word, and God has always had grace. And that's always fit into the plan. And it's not something that's changing what he originally set up or what he does day in and day out through our lives. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. It does. And I would agree with the notion that we create gods in our own image on a daily basis, because actually, if we were to take C.S. Lewis's both examples, descriptions of God, a God, and he will later deal with this, a God who is all powerful and a God who is all good. The next chapter, he's going to deal with all good, and we'll get into that. Those are the two dynamics upon which humanity strive for: perfect morality and supreme power. And those are the two biggest problems that we face in humanity right now.
I was going to say, I mean, we strive for it, but in some ways, especially in America, the power trumps the morality.
Right. I literally just finished watching the final debate, presidential debate, and it all it is a tussle left, right, and center for power and morality on so many different levels. It's a reincarnation of what we see to be the most important aspects of who we are, which I guess tells you where our heart is, because and who our creator is ultimately, and how much we perverted those aspects of power and morality in that respect. Is there, sorry, go on.
I might add, stands in stark contrast to what we see in Jesus here on earth, showing us who God is, right, and how God meant things to be on earth.
Right.
I just had to bring that up. I mean,
it's
almost a polar opposite.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just interesting.
I guess the polar opposite in the respect that he shows supreme power by serving.
Right.
Yeah. Is there anything else that really struck out from you from this chapter that is worth mentioning for both of you?
This chapter seemed to me to be half of what he really wanted to see, and so I was encouraged. It was almost a little bit of a shorter chapter, but then I saw the next,
Did you cheat, John?
Divine goodness.
I hope you didn't cheat.
I didn't cheat.
Okay.
But I felt like he was touching on things that needed to be touched on. And the biggest thing was that, an omnipotent God is limited in what he can do, at least from our perspective, because he's doing what he's doing out of love to give us ultimate freedom. And that was kind of what Satan at the very beginning said, is these people serve you because you make them serve you.
Right.
And he said no. And we had the whole great controversy, and now Satan's ruling this earth, and in a completely opposite way, honestly, but the claim is still the same. They serve you because you make them serve you. And that's being played out. So, I'll be curious to see what the next chapter adds to it.
Mm-hmm. And this, I guess, this leads us into a little bit of the introduction into the next chapter, which he talks about towards the end. This chapter is proof conclusive to me what C.S. Lewis is trying to argue. You can't just have an omnipotent God.
Right.
You cannot just have just a God, and that's all he is. He is just omnipotent. There has to be something more to that, because there are many humans who claim to be omnipotent in some respect, and many other gods that humans have created whose only asset is to be omnipotent. But the introduction of goodness is what we will later on find out in the next chapter. And I'm going to quote the very final few words in this chapter, which I thought really piqued the interest quite well. Our design is less, page 27, our design is a less formidable one. And he's talking about what he wants to try and break down later. Mm-hmm. It is only to discover how perceiving a suffering world and being assured on quite different grounds that, and here it is, that God is good, we are to conceive that goodness and that suffering without contradiction. Because that's the heart of the question for everyone. How can those two elements exist without contradiction? Any final thoughts before we wrap up, guys?
No, I mean, that really baited me, and no, I haven't read the next chapter. I wanted to, I just didn't get a chance to. But
Sure.
I'm looking forward to next week's discussion.
Any final thoughts, Dee?
No.
Okay. Well, it's been definitely a challenge to get through C.S. Lewis. I'll admit it to both of you. There's been several times where I was just like, oh, why are we reading this book? Because it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah, I almost feel like I need an Oxford dictionary next to me. So I was like, what?
Well, this is an Oxford genius, so hey. But
I'm looking up words all the time. I'm looking up the words.
But I think what he's definitely doing is stretching us out of our comfort zones to really imagine, because this is theology, to imagine theology in really greater plateaus than we're used to. And it causes us to ask questions that we don't normally ask. Because here's the thing, and I'll be honest, when we talk about the omnipotence of God, or even trying to prove conclusively who God is, I've never heard anyone argue from that perspective that C.S. Lewis is coming from. The nature of how everything reacts to everything, reacts to everything. And if you just change one little thing, we probably have heard it before. Maybe you've heard it, I don't know the figures. If you were to move the moon a certain amount of centimeters to the right or up, down, like it would be almost catastrophic for planet Earth. And yet in Job, the Bible clearly says that God is the one who hangs the Pleiades in its orbit, who literally keeps it there. And he has intentionally placed all these things, interactions, environments, and he just places it in the most perfect place for us, not just to exist, but to thrive as human beings, whilst surrounded by suffering.
Yeah.
Which is just, yeah. Anyway, we should end there. Thanks for the discussion, guys. And for those of you who are joining us online, we were late bringing out the last video. Apologies for that. I only just found out because Dee texted me and I quickly realized, and I said, I didn't actually post it. And it's now posted up so you can catch up. Apologies for that if you've been following us. And if you want to see all the episodes from previous episodes, you can jump online to eastsidesda.org/pages to progress, and you'll be able to catch up with everything. But next week, we'll be diving into the next chapter of the problem of pain, which is divine goodness. Probably another dense chapter, no doubt. We're going to have to read 2 or 3 times to try and understand it, but hopefully we'll be able to have some rich discussion. So this is from us, wishing you good evening, good morning, whenever you're watching this. Goodbye. Take care.